Hello, gorgeous people. I'm back with a book review as promised. So today I will be reviewing The Alchemy of Happiness by Al-Ghazali. And Al-Ghazali happens to be someone that I grew up reading. It was one of the required readings for us in high school in Lebanon, Tripoli Evangelical School. So a little bit about Al-Ghazali, for those who don't know him or are not familiar with his writings. He can be considered to be a Sufi mystic. He was born in 1111 AD in Iran, which is Persia. And he is one of the great Islamic philosophers. He's also considered to be an authority next to the prophets, Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, an authority in Islamic theology and jurisprudence. So I'm going to start off by not sugarcoating anything. I have a hard time with the ending of this book. So I have some mixed feelings around this book, and it could just be because of the translation. As you can see here, this is translated by Claude Field from Persian, obviously. So I feel like a lot of stuff gets lost in translation when attempting to find out what the actual meaning was and what the author intended, right? So it could be a case of that happening here in this book, and I will get to it as I go through the different chapters. So let's start off. I was going to fall in love with this book, but then when this happened, I had to slightly withdraw and question what's going on. Anyway, I'll get to that. So to Al-Ghazali, which is basically what this book is about, the way to attain happiness is achieved by knowing oneself, knowing God, knowing the world, knowing the next world, which is what happens after we die. And he divides the book into those chapters literally. Or I wonder if the translator did that. I have to get my hands on an original copy just to see at some point exactly how these chapters are divided. And then he ends with 4 more chapters, one about music and dance, and then chapter 6 is about self-examination and the recollection of God. Chapter 7 is where I had to pull the brakes a little bit on falling in love with the book. It talks about marriage and how marriage can either be a help to our spirituality or a hindrance to it. And then he ends with the love of God and how that can be achieved in a person, and what are the things that make you not hate God, but kind of move away from God. So in the first chapter, Knowing Oneself, he says that in order to achieve happiness, we have to know who we are. We have to know where we're coming from and where we're going. We have to understand what makes us happy and what doesn't make us happy. He also says we need to understand that we're made of body, the physical, and the soul, which is the metaphysical aspect of us that is behind the veil. He says the highest faculty that a person has is their reason. But I'm going to disagree with that slightly. And I think there have been other philosophers who have debated this idea, and that's what we studied in high school. And maybe I'll get into that in another video. But I'm going to disagree because to me, I think the highest faculty that a human has is love, not reason. And we can have a discussion about that. And then I just wanted to point out here that literally what he's saying harkens back to the Hermetic principle of so within, like as within, so without, and as above, so below, because he's saying that we understand ourselves as the microcosm and a reflection of the macrocosm, literally, is what his meaning of this whole thing is in chapter 1. And then in the second chapter, which he titles Knowing God, the number 2 thing to do to achieve happiness is to understand and know God. And he says that there are 2 ways to arrive to this knowledge, and that in this book, he's not going to go into the first method because it can confuse people and it's very difficult to understand. But he goes into the one method, which is, he's saying that it is through either divine revelation, through illumination in one's heart. It's also through spiritual practice, and it's also can be done through mystical experience. And I think the mystical experience part is the one that he didn't want to dive into because it could be very difficult to understand unless you actually encounter it in your own life. And then he also says, which is really interesting, that reason is sometimes the reason why we can't comprehend divine and spiritual experience. Whereas in the beginning, he was saying that reason is actually a good thing for humans because it's their highest faculty. But here he is saying that reason is the reason why we are unable to comprehend metaphysical stuff. So again, this could be something that within the translation from the original text, it just kind of got lost and mixed up, and like, who knows what it is. We need somebody who's like very familiar with the original text in the original language to explain it. Then number 3 is knowing the world. So understanding that this world is impermanent is what helps us achieve happiness. He calls the world a marketplace passed on our way to the next. He says that it pretends that it will always remain with us, but she's a sorceress. She seduces men to their destruction. And I'm going to read page 48 of this translation because I thought it was pretty powerful description of the world. So he goes on to describe the world, and he says, another dangerous property of worldly things is that they at first appear as mere trifles. But each of these so-called trifles branches out into countless ramifications until they swallow up the whole of a man's time and energy. Jesus, on whom be peace, said, the lover of the world is like a man drinking seawater. The more he drinks, the more thirsty he gets, till at last he perishes with thirst unquenched. The prophet said, you can no more mix with the world without being contaminated by it than you can go into water without getting wet. So he's reminding us that this world it sucks us in, it taints us, it makes us lose our path, and that we have to be very careful about this knowledge, and to remember that there are things in this world that are not of it. And he says those are the good deeds and knowledge, that we need to balance our desires and work for the hereafter rather than our worldly life. So let our deeds be more in consideration of what's next as opposed to what's here. So instead of growing our wealth, we need to focus on growing our good deeds so that when we're in the hereafter, we can find salvation. I want to also point that in the beginning of this book, I just remembered, so he mentions Jesus, and this is literally Islam believes that that the Prophet Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was the last of many prophets. It's a lineage, right? And he says that God has sent on earth 124,000 prophets to teach men the prescription of this alchemy, meaning the alchemy of happiness, of how to be happy. Literally what he's describing in this book. Ooh. Okay, so moving on to number 4, which is knowing the next world, obviously, which means the hereafter, hell and heaven. So in hell, well, he says that sometimes hell can be in this life, whereas, we're losing things and finding some shame and feeling shameful and disappointed in our life currently will be some sort of a taste of hell. And understanding that there will be a hereafter is this knowledge helps us achieve happiness because we have a way to save ourselves. So we're here being tested, but once we pass over, we are, it all depends on the deeds that we've done in this world. And it's interesting because today I happened upon an article about death, specifically in Islam, but it goes into like different traditions like Buddhist and Hindu and Judaism and all that, and how death is perceived and prepared for. And what I wanted to share here is that in Islam, it is believed that when a person dies, they go to a place called the barzakh, which is literally a barrier. It translates into a barrier, but it's like the place between here and there. It's like where all souls are held until kingdom come, until the end of the world. And it's a really interesting article. I posted it on my Facebook, so you're welcome to check it out over there. Or I might also add the link here in this YouTube video so that it'll be easy for you to find. It's just very interesting. There's a lot I can go into, but this is not about death. So let's keep going. So these are the 4 things that we need to be happy, to understand these things. And it's not just understanding them on a superficial level. It's like embodying them and experiencing them and really like, what do you call it? Like deeper inner knowing, which comes from the experience of something. But he also comes to, in this 5th chapter, which I love, he talks about music and dance, which are both so dear to my heart, and how they are a means to reach ultimate happiness. And he just cautions us that we need to use them wisely, because he says music fans the flames of emotions. And if you're in a negative emotion, it will exasperate that for you. And if you're in a good emotion, it will also magnify it. So they must be used with caution, both of them. He also recommends that if somebody was to attempt dancing, which in this case is the Sufi dancing, which is the trance-like dancing, which is basically ecstatic dance. It's something that he says you need a teacher for, so do not attempt it without a teacher, which makes me wonder about all these ecstatic dances that have branched out and if they're really fulfilling their purpose, that the preliminary reason for was, you know what I'm saying? Like if this is really actually fulfilling what they were put in place for. So then, chapter 6, he talks about self-examination and recollection of God, which both of these things are basically handled in chapter 1 and 2. So self-examination is understanding oneself, and then things that can help us to understand and know and remember God within us and around us. And he does go into all the things that hinder a man from recollection or takes him away from God. And I didn't mark it, but maybe I can find some of those things. I don't want to make this video too long, but I think I'm doing good on time. So yeah, the things that take us away from God. Can't find it. I wish I could remember one thing. So, sure, I should have made a note of that. My bad. Okay, one of the things is that when you rise in the morning to remember God and know that God will look after you. This is one thing that can be done literally as soon as you wake up in the morning. Just that remembrance is a means to happiness, is in his opinion. So then we come to chapter 7, which talks about marriage, and he talks about how it can hinder and increase our connection with God. So he says that usually marriage, there will be children, and children are considered a way to salvation for their parents, because if a child prays for their parents, they will be forgiven their sins. This is what is considered in Islam. Then it can also be helpful because the women will take the burden of caring for the house so that the man can worship. So here is where I would like to ask, are women not supposed to worship? So I do have a problem with that, like a really, really big problem. Because to think that women were just created to take care of the house so that the men can worship is pretty much patriarchal, in my opinion. And I don't think that God wants it that way. I don't even believe that the Prophet, Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, wanted it that way either. So I'll have to question this a lot, and the translation, and I don't know. I need to get my hands on the original copy because I have a feeling it's been mistranslated. He says that women are created weak, and that if they were found to be betraying their husband, that they should be stricken. Now, I recently had a conversation with a really good friend about this, and we were discussing how the different translations of the Quran have this all messed up. So strike can be translated into two different things. One of them is to hit, but the other one is to walk away. So when the Quran says to hit your wives, it doesn't mean to actually literally hit them. It means to walk away from them. So if they betray you, you just walk away from them. That makes more sense to me, don't you think? Anyway, The last chapter here, it talks about the love of God, and he goes into things that can pull you away from God. So something like if you're or actually the things that bring you closer to God, sorry. So one of them is to sacrifice your will for the will of God. So realizing that sometimes you want something, but it doesn't happen because there's like a divine plan there that you don't see. There's some good in it, but you think it's bad. To actually not fear death, that's another one that can bring you closer, or it's a sign of like loving God. A third is the remembrance of God, of course, which is like literally, like we said earlier, to remember God every time you wake up. To actually prefer to be alone than with company, because when you're alone, you have the chance to worship. And once you begin to worship a lot, then worship becomes easier and easier. And that is the end of this book. Now, Al-Ghazali has many other writings, and I feel like I want to explore more of his writings in the future. But please feel free to comment, share your questions or conversations. I'd love to converse about all these books that I share here. One thing too is to just let me know your thoughts. I'm very curious, especially those who have read Al-Ghazali and who are familiar with these writings. I would like to know more about what you think, especially of the last chapter, well, chapter 7 about marriage. All right, this is it for today, and I'll hope to see you again next time. Bye.